As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, signed by 17 senators.
Unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Is there an objection?
Without objection.
Without an objection. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Ms. Baldwin.
No.
Mr. Barrasso.
Aye.
Mr. Bennett.
No.
Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt.
Aye.
Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
Aye.
Mr. Brown.
No.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito.
Votes aye.
Mr. Cardin.
No.
Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker.
Aye.
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton.
Aye.
Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz.
Aye.
Mr. Daines.
Aye.
Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi.
Aye.
Mrs. Ernst.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake.
Aye.
Mr. Gardner.
Aye.
Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Ms. Harris.
No.
Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich.
No.
Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller.
Aye.
Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven.
Aye.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe.
Aye.
Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kaine.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
Aye.
Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Kyle.
Aye.
Mr. Lankford.
Aye.
Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey.
No.
Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley.
No.
Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy.
No.
Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul.
Aye.
Mr. Perdue.
Aye.
Mr. Peters.
No.
Mr. Portman.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch.
Aye.
Mr. Roberts.
Aye.
Mr. Rounds.
Aye.
Mr. Rubio.
Aye.
Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass.
Aye.
Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune.
Aye.
Mr. Tillis.
Aye.
Mr. Toomey.
Aye.
Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren.
No.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
Aye.
Mr. Nelson. Ms. Cantwell.
Madam President.
Mr. Booker.
Madam President.
Ms. Moran.
Aye.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Kennedy, Kyle, Langford, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Manchin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Heinrich, Kaine, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Schatz, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Jones? No. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Schumer? No. Mr. Donnelly? No. Ms. Heitkamp? No. Mrs. McCaskill? No. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Reed? No. Mr. King? No. Mr. Van Hollen? No. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mrs. Shaheen? No. Mr. Carper.
Senator's not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Carper, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to change their vote? As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries.
The yeas are 51, the nays are 49. The motion is agreed to.
Thank you. On this vote, the yeas are 51, the noes are 49. The motion is agreed to.